In 1947, a coal miner in West Virginia earned about $4 a day. Half of it went back to the company before he ever saw it, for rent on the company house, credit at the company store, and deductions for tools and lamp oil and the dynamite he used underground. What was left went to his wife, and his wife turned it into food. 3 meals a day for a man who burned 5,000 calories a shift, crawling through tunnels 18 inches high, in air so thick with dust he coughed black for an hour after every shift. She fed him on what the company store would sell her, at prices the company set, in a kitchen where the stove burned coal, because that was the one thing the mountains gave for free. Number 21 on this list cost less than a nickel to make and kept a man working for 12 hours underground. Number 14 was invented by a miner's wife in eastern Kentucky and spread through the coal fields without a single word being written down. And number 1, the meal that appeared on every miner's table more than any other, was so simple that nobody called it cooking. They called it keeping a man alive. These 25 meals came from the hardest kitchens in America. Hit subscribe. Let us count them down. Number 25. Soup, beans and cornbread. Dried pinto beans cooked all day on the stove with salt pork or a ham hock, a diced onion and enough water to cover. Cornbread baked in a cast iron skillet greased with lard. This was the Monday through Friday dinner in coal field kitchens across West Virginia, eastern Kentucky, southwestern Virginia, and the mountains of Tennessee. A pound of dried pintos cost about 8 cents. The cornmeal cost a nickel. The salt pork was whatever was left from the last hog the family butchered. A woman put the beans on the stove at 7 in the morning, and they simmered all day while she did everything else, including laundry, tending children, working the garden, and cleaning coal dust off every surface in the house. By evening, the beans were thick and creamy, and the pot liquor was smoky and dark. The man came home black from the mine, washed at a basin on the porch, and sat down to beans and cornbread without a word. The meal didn't need conversation. It needed to be there, and it always was. Number 24. Fried potatoes. 5 potatoes sliced thin and fried in lard in a cast iron skillet until the edges went dark and crispy. Salt and pepper, nothing else. The whole meal cost about 6 cents and kept a man full for hours because the starch and the fat worked together to slow digestion. Miners' wives fried potatoes 3 or 4 mornings a week alongside whatever else was going. Eggs if the hens were laying, sausage if the hog had been killed recently, nothing if the pantry was lean. Fried potatoes were not a side dish in a coal field kitchen. They were the foundation. Every other item on the plate was a luxury built on top of the one thing that was always available, always cheap, and always filling enough to send a man underground without his stomach turning on him by noon. Number 23. Biscuits and gravy. Flour, lard, buttermilk, and a pinch of salt made biscuits. The gravy came from whatever drippings were in the pan, sausage, bacon, or just lard, and it was thickened with flour and thinned with milk. The biscuits went into the oven before dawn. The gravy was made in the same skillet the sausage had cooked in. A man ate 4 biscuits covered in gravy, drank a cup of coffee, and walked to the mine. The meal cost about 12 cents for the whole family. Biscuits and gravy was the breakfast of the Appalachian coal fields, the way eggs and toast were the breakfast of the cities, so fundamental that not making it was unthinkable. A woman who couldn't make biscuits had not been raised in the mountains. A woman who made biscuits every morning without fail had been raised exactly there. Number 22. Chicken and dumplings. A hen too old to lay went into the pot. The bird simmered for hours until the meat fell off the bones, which were fished out by hand. Flour, dumplings, just flour, salt and water, rolled thin and cut into strips, dropped into the boiling broth and cooked for 10 minutes. The broth turned cloudy and thick from the starch. The dumplings went soft on the outside and stayed slightly chewy in the center. A single old hen fed a family of 6 this way because the dumplings stretched the broth into a meal that filled every bowl to the rim. A woman who killed her last laying hen for chicken and dumplings was making a calculation. The eggs lost this week against the full stomachs tonight. The math was never easy. The dumplings were always good. Number 21. Cornmeal mush. Cornmeal was stirred into boiling salted water until it thickened into a porridge that could be eaten hot with milk and sugar, or poured into a pan, cooled, sliced and fried the next morning in lard until both sides were golden. A pound of cornmeal cost 4 cents. Hot mush for supper, fried mush for breakfast. The same 4 cents fed the family twice. Miners' wives perfected the timing. Mush went into the pan after supper and was set on the back porch overnight, where the cold mountain air firmed it by morning. Sliced and fried, it came out with a crust that crackled and an inside that was warm and creamy. A miner carried fried mush in his dinner pail alongside a biscuit and a jar of coffee. It stayed solid underground for hours, which was the only engineering requirement for any food that went into the mine. Number 20. Leather britches. Green beans strung on thread and hung from the rafters of the porch to dry in the mountain air. Once dried, they were stored in cloth sacks and lasted all winter. Rehydrated in water and cooked for hours with a piece of salt pork, they turned tender and deeply flavored, richer and more concentrated than fresh green beans because the drying intensified everything. Leather britches were Appalachian preservation technology older than canning, older than refrigeration, older than the mines themselves. A woman who strung beans in August was feeding her family in February. The thread and the rafters and the mountain wind did the work. The woman did the planning. Every string of beans hanging on a porch was a promise that winter would not win this year. Number 19. Killed lettuce. A bowl of fresh leaf lettuce from the garden, not iceberg, the soft green leaves that grew in the mountain dirt, dressed with a sauce made from hot bacon grease, vinegar, sugar and salt poured directly over the leaves. The heat wilted the lettuce instantly. The grease coated every leaf. The vinegar cut through the fat. The sugar balanced the acid. This was spring food, eaten when the garden came in and the lettuce was young and tender. A plate of killed lettuce with cornbread was supper on a warm April evening, and the women who made it will tell you that nothing from any grocery store has ever tasted as good as lettuce from your own garden, killed in bacon grease you saved from breakfast. The name was the recipe. You killed the lettuce with the grease. Nothing survived but flavor. Number 18. Stack cake. Thin layers of cake dough, almost like cookies, baked individually and stacked 6 or 8 layers high with dried apple filling between each one. The cake was assembled a day or 2 before eating, so the apple filling could soften the layers, and the whole thing could meld into a dense, spiced, moist cake that cut into slices, showing every layer. Stack cake was the Appalachian wedding cake, the church homecoming dessert, and the Christmas centerpiece. A woman's worth as a baker was measured in part by her stack cake, by how many layers, how thin, how even. The dried apples were cooked from rings she had dried on the porch the previous fall, the same way she had dried the leather britches. Everything came from the mountain. Everything was preserved by the air. The stack cake was Appalachia on a plate, patient, layered, and built from almost nothing into something extraordinary. Number 17. Tomato gravy. A can of tomatoes, home-canned or store-bought, cooked in a skillet with flour and bacon drippings until the mixture thickened into a rusty, tangy gravy. Poured over biscuits. That was breakfast on the mornings when there were no eggs and no sausage, and the bacon was gone, but the drippings remained. The tomato gave the gravy acidity that cut through the fat. The flour gave it body. A plate of biscuits and tomato gravy cost about 3 cents and filled a grown man enough to get down the shaft and start swinging a pick. The women who made tomato gravy did not think of it as a substitute for a real breakfast. It was real breakfast. The mountains did not care what a meal was supposed to be. They only cared whether it was enough. Number 16. Shucky beans. Dried shelled beans, October beans, cranberry beans, whatever the garden had produced, cooked slowly with a ham bone and onion. Similar to soup beans but chunkier, the beans holding their shape longer, the broth thinner. Served with cornbread and a raw onion sliced on the side that a miner bit into like an apple between spoonfuls of beans. The raw onion was not a garnish. It was a vitamin delivery system that mountain people had used for generations before anyone called it nutrition. The sulfur compounds cleared the sinuses. Vitamin C prevented scurvy in a diet that was dangerously short on fresh produce during winter months. A miner eating shucky beans with a raw onion was medicating himself and feeding himself in the same meal. Number 15. Ramps and potatoes. In early spring, before the garden was producing, wild ramps grew on the mountain slopes. A pungent, wild leek that smelled like garlic and onion had a fight in a forest. Women and children dug them by the sackful. The ramps were cleaned, chopped, and fried with sliced potatoes in bacon fat until everything was soft and fragrant and golden. The smell of ramps frying carried for a quarter-mile down the hollow and announced to every neighbor that spring had arrived. Ramps and potatoes were free food from the mountain, requiring nothing but the labor of digging and the fat to cook them in. Children who ate ramps before school smelled so strongly of them that teachers in coalfield schools could identify ramp season by the air in the classroom. Number 14. Soup from a bone. When the last scrap of meat had been eaten from a ham, a beef shank, or a pork shoulder, the bone went into a pot of water with an onion, a carrot if there was one, salt and pepper. Simmered for hours, the bone released its marrow and gelatin into the water, turning plain water into a broth with body and richness, and a flavor that had no right to come from something that had already been eaten once. Potatoes went in near the end. Cornmeal dumplings if the family had no potatoes. The soup stretched the memory of a piece of meat across 3 more meals, and the wife who made it understood that the bone was not garbage. The bone was the beginning of the next dinner. Nothing was thrown away, because nothing could be afforded to be thrown away. Number 13. Fried cornbread cakes. Not baked cornbread. Fried. Cornmeal, salt and water mixed into a thick batter, dropped by the spoonful into hot lard in a cast iron skillet. Fried until both sides were dark golden and the inside was still slightly soft. Eaten hot, sometimes with nothing, sometimes with sorghum syrup drizzled over the top. A batch cost about 3 cents and made enough for a family of 6. These were the bread of the coal fields, faster than biscuits, cheaper than loaf bread, and fried in the same lard that cooked everything else. A miner's dinner pail often carried 2 fried cornbread cakes wrapped in a cloth. They held up underground. They didn't crumble. They didn't need butter. They were fuel, shaped by hand and fried by a woman who had been making them since she was old enough to stand at the stove. Number 12. Poke salad. Pokeweed was gathered from the hillside in spring when the shoots were young and tender. The leaves were boiled twice, once to remove the toxins. The water was thrown out, and then the leaves were boiled again in clean water. The twice-boiled greens were then fried in bacon grease with salt, and sometimes scrambled with eggs. Poke salad was foraged food, free from the mountain, and required the specific knowledge of when to pick it and how to prepare it. Raw pokeweed is poisonous. The young spring shoots, properly boiled, are not. That knowledge was passed from mother to daughter in the coal fields, the way other families passed down recipes for cake. The stakes were higher. Get it wrong, and the family got sick. Get it right, and the family ate free greens in April when the pantry was at its emptiest. Number 11. Wilted greens and cornbread. Mustard greens, turnip greens, or collards from the garden, washed and boiled with a piece of fatback until the greens turned dark and silky. The pot liquor was the best part, salty and green and rich with pork fat. A bowl of greens and pot liquor with a piece of cornbread for soaking was a complete supper that cost almost nothing because the greens came from the garden and the fatback came from the hog. The cornbread went into the liquid and soaked it up like a sponge. A man ate this after 10 hours underground, and the warmth of the greens, the salt of the pork, and the soft cornbread dissolving in the pot liquor put him to sleep in the chair before his wife could clear the table. Number 10. Fried apple pies. Dried apple rings were rehydrated and cooked with sugar and cinnamon into a thick filling. Biscuit dough was rolled thin, cut into circles, filled with a spoonful of the apple mixture, folded in half, crimped with a fork, and fried in lard until golden brown on both sides. The crust shattered when you bit through it. The apple filling inside was hot, sweet, and spiced. Fried apple pies were the dessert of the coalfields, made from apples dried the previous fall, carried in dinner pails as a treat, and served at church homecomings and family reunions. A woman who made good fried pies was known for it, the way a man was known for his work ethic. The skill was in the dough, thin enough to fry crisp, thick enough to hold the filling without splitting. That balance was learned over years and never fully taught. You watched your mother. You burned your first batch. You got better. Number 9. Potato soup. Potatoes, onion, water, salt, and a splash of milk, if milk was available. Boiled until the potatoes fell apart and the broth turned thick and starchy. That was soup. A pot cost about 8 cents and fed 6 people on a night when there was nothing else. Potato soup was the emergency meal, the meal between paydays, the meal of the 3rd week of the month when the credit at the company store had run out. The garden was empty, and the only thing in the cellar was a sack of potatoes. A woman made potato soup, and nobody said it was only potato soup, because saying that was saying something about the money, and the money was not discussed at the table. The soup was hot. The soup was enough. The soup was what there was. Number 8. Cornbread and milk. Leftover cornbread crumbled into a glass of cold buttermilk or sweet milk. Eaten with a spoon. This was supper on summer nights when the kitchen was too hot for cooking and the day had been too long for effort. A glass of cornbread and milk cost about 2 cents. It was cool and filling and required no heat and no time and no energy from a woman who had already spent all 3. Miners' wives ate this after the children were in bed, standing at the counter in the dark, the house finally quiet, the cornbread softening in the milk while the mountain night came in through the open window. It was not a meal they would have chosen. It was a meal that chose them. Number 7. Squirrel and dumplings. A squirrel or two, cleaned and quartered, simmered in water with salt and pepper until the small bones loosened and the meat turned tender. Dumplings dropped into the broth. The squirrel gave the broth a gamey richness that chicken couldn't match. Men and boys hunted squirrels on the hillsides above the coal camps with single-shot rifles, and the kills went directly to the kitchen. A squirrel was free protein in a diet that was chronically short on meat. 2 squirrels made enough dumplings for a family. The women who cooked them had learned to work around the small bones and the dark meat and the gamey flavor that required longer simmering. Squirrel and dumplings was the meal that proved the mountain fed you if you knew how to ask it. Number 6. Sorghum on biscuits. Hot biscuits split open and drizzled with sorghum molasses, the dark, thick, bittersweet syrup pressed from sorghum cane grown in patches on the mountain farms. A jar of sorghum lasted a family for weeks because you used it a tablespoon at a time. On a hot biscuit, the sorghum melted into the crumb, turning the bread dark and sticky and sweet in a way that sugar couldn't match. Sorghum was the Appalachian sweetener, cheaper than sugar, richer in flavor, produced locally by farmers who pressed the cane in the fall and sold it from their porches. A biscuit with sorghum was dessert on the nights when dessert was not in the budget. It was also breakfast. The line between the two was thinner than the sorghum itself. Number 5. Soup beans and fried potatoes together. Not soup beans alone, not fried potatoes alone. The combination, a bowl of beans alongside a plate of crispy fried potatoes, eaten alternately, the soft beans and the crunchy potatoes trading textures in the mouth, a piece of cornbread or raw onion on the side. This was the complete coalfield dinner, the meal that covered every nutritional base at the lowest possible cost. The beans provided protein and fiber. The potatoes provided carbohydrates and energy. The onion provided vitamins. The lard provided fat. The whole plate came in under 10 cents for a family of 6, and it kept a man functioning through a 12-hour shift, 2,000 feet below the surface of the earth. Soup beans and fried potatoes was not a combination anyone invented. It was a combination that necessity assembled, and the women who served it understood that the meal was not creative. It was correct. Number 4. Fatback and biscuits. Salt-cured pork, fatback, sliced thin and fried in a skillet until the fat rendered and the edges went crispy and brown. Eaten on a biscuit, like bacon but cheaper. Fatback was the cut nobody else wanted, which meant it was the cut the miner's wife could afford. The rendered fat stayed in the skillet and became the grease for the next 3 meals. Nothing was wasted. The fatback itself was salty and rich and chewy, with a pork flavor more intense than bacon, because there was no smoke and no sugar cure, just salt and fat and heat. A man who ate fatback and biscuits for breakfast was eating the leanest version of a meat meal his family could produce. The fatback cost about 5 cents a pound. The biscuits cost even less. The meal was poverty in its most honest form, and the women who served it did not pretend otherwise. They just made sure the biscuits were good. Number 3. Garden vegetable soup. Whatever the garden produced that week, tomatoes, corn, green beans, potatoes, onions, cabbage, squash, was cut up and simmered in water with salt and a piece of fatback for flavor. The soup changed every week because the garden changed every week. July soup tasted different from September soup. Early summer was mostly greens and potatoes. Late summer was tomatoes and corn. Fall was root vegetables and squash. The soup was the garden in liquid form. A woman's planting decisions from March, arriving at the table in August. A pot of garden soup cost nothing beyond the labor of growing and the salt in the pot. It was the most nutritious meal on this entire list, and the women who made it were feeding their families from soil they had worked with their own hands. The mine owned the house. The company owned the store. But the garden belonged to the wife, and the soup that came from it was the one meal the company could not touch. Number 2. Pinto beans and cornbread, the Sunday version. The same beans, the same cornbread. But on Sunday the beans got a ham hock instead of salt pork. The cornbread got an extra tablespoon of lard. The onion on the side was sliced thicker. And the table got a jar of chow chow, a pickled relish of green tomatoes, cabbage, onion and peppers that the wife had canned the previous fall. Sunday beans were weekday beans with dignity. The difference was small in ingredients and enormous in meaning. A woman who put chow chow on the Sunday table was saying, "This is not a regular day." The extra effort, the ham hock found at the butcher, the chow chow jar brought up from the cellar, announced that one day a week the family would eat not just to survive, but to sit together and acknowledge that surviving was worth celebrating. Number 1. The dinner pail. This is not a meal served at a table. This is the meal a wife packed for her husband at 4 in the morning before he left for the mine. A metal pail with a wire handle divided into compartments. A biscuit on the bottom. A piece of fried fatback or sausage wrapped in a cloth. 2 fried cornbread cakes. A boiled egg when there were eggs. A jar of coffee, not a thermos. A glass canning jar sealed tight and wrapped in a rag to keep it warm. The pail was packed in silence in a dark kitchen while the children slept. The woman moved by memory. She knew where the lard was without looking. She wrapped the biscuit without measuring. She sealed the jar without spilling. The man took the pail and walked to the mine and ate what she had packed 2,000 feet underground in a tunnel lit by the lamp on his helmet, sitting on a rock, the coal dust falling into his food. He ate it anyway. He ate every crumb because she had packed it and because the walk home was 8 hours away and the pail was all he had until then. The dinner pail was the most important meal in the history of American coal mining. Not because of what was inside it, because of who packed it. A woman standing alone in a kitchen at 4 in the morning, putting food into a metal box for a man who might not come home. That was the meal. That was the love. That was the entire story of the coal fields, told in a biscuit and a jar of coffee and a wife's hands working in the dark. That is 25 meals from the kitchens of women who fed families on almost nothing in the hardest mountains in America. Every one of them is real. Every one of them was made from whatever the garden grew, the company store sold, and the mountain gave for free. If your family came from coal country, if your grandmother made soup beans and cornbread and packed a dinner pail before dawn, put her name in the comments. She deserves to be remembered. Share this with someone from the coal fields. And subscribe, because these women built Appalachia one meal at a time, and nobody ever wrote their names down.